Pat Buchanan, how would you describe Winston Churchill?
Winston Churchill was a great man, one of the greatest of the century, a man of extraordinary accomplishments and extraordinary capacities and abilities, but of an incurably flawed judgment. And I think Winston Churchill, for all his triumphs and successes, was probably the man most responsible for the early and rapid collapse of the British Empire. I think some of his judgments were colossally wrong, some of them were right, and I do believe he's probably one of the most extraordinary men who ever lived.
Expand on why you think he is responsible for the collapse of the British Empire.
I think what brought the British Empire down as rapidly as it did and as terribly as it did was World War II. In my judgment, World War II was exactly what Churchill called it, the unnecessary war. And the fatal blunder, as I describe it in my book, was the decision in panic of the British government after Czechoslovakia fell apart in 1939 March to give an unsolicited war guarantee to a collection of Polish colonels who had a romantic view of their own warlike capacities, who had participated in the breakup of Czechoslovakia. And Britain gave this war guarantee unsolicited to back the Poles in a cause, control of Danzig, where they thought the Germans were fundamentally right. And that war guarantee, which stiffened the Polish spine, gave the Poles the backbone to stand up to Hitler, who now had no way out but to take Danzig. Hitler attacked Poland. The British declared war on Germany. That 6-year war brought down the British Empire. And the man who was driving hardest for war with Germany was Winston Churchill.
Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
Anybody in this country doesn't minimize their tax. They want their heads ripped.
Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, or they might not choose socialism.
The answer is might, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly. I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is joining us on this Sunday afternoon. It's a little bit different from our normal time that we do this podcast, but if you are watching this live, thank you for sticking with us. And if you are watching live and you're in the chat, we want to hear from you as well. The best episodes are the ones where we hear from you, the audience. So we want to know what you're thinking. And if you want to ask some questions of our guests, please do so. And I might be able to ask those through the podcast. And if you are feeling really up to it and you're not so shy, you might want to hit that link to StreamYard as well and call in. It's Talkback Streaming. We want to hear from you, just like Talkback Radio. So don't be afraid. Click that link and you can call in and ask a question or just give your opinion or whatever it might be. But let's kick things off because I'm really, really excited about today's episode. We've got a great returning guest. But before we get there, I'm going to let you know about how you can support us. And it's by heading to Buy Me a Coffee. Now, if you head to Buy Me a Coffee, you can throw us a few dollars. Helps to pay for the streaming services that we use that we just got a big bill for. So you might be able to throw us a few dollars to help out with that. Also helps to pay for the website hosting. And also, most importantly, gives me a very warm and fuzzy feeling inside, which is very, very important. So please head to Buy Me a Coffee if you want to contribute. And while you're at it, also head to commandingthenarrative.com. It's the best place to go to keep up to date with everything that we're doing. If you want to know who's been on the podcast in the last few weeks, it's all up there on the website. We had a great panel last week with Adam Zara and Paul Vallejo talking about a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. So that was a little bit of a precursor to tonight's discussion. And also we've had some really great podcasts in the last few weeks, one with Mike Ryan, which was very, very interesting about independent media. And of course, we talked about the dismissal with Dr. Christopher Reynolds, which was very insightful, going back to the birth of our Constitution, really, and why we do have a separation between the Prime Minister and the Governor General. And while you're on the website, you'll also find all our latest articles, a couple of surveys that you might want to participate in. And also, if you want to know who's coming up on the podcast this week, you'll find it all there on the website. If you head to the top of the page, you can hit the sign up button. in the top right-hand corner, and you'll get the newsletter, and you'll be able to keep up to date with everything that we're doing. And lastly, I should let you know about Australians for Better Government. We're doing some great things with Australians for Better Government. If you are interested in what it's all about, please head to the website australiansforbetter.com. It's about reforming our system of government, not just accepting the system that we have now, which is basically dictated to us by the politicians. We want a people's movement to push back and reform our system and make some improvements to our system. And it's all there at australiansforbetter.com. I encourage you to check it out and also sign up for membership as well. The more members that we have, the greater our movement will be. So please check it out. So anyway, today I've got a returning guest, Professor Eric Louw. He was on the podcast episode 88 back in July. We were talking about apartheid and the history of apartheid. And it was probably one of the best podcasts that I've done, not just this year, but in the whole span of Commanding the Narrative. I really, really enjoyed it. It was a great podcast. And if you want to know a little bit more about Professor Louw, he's a retired professor of political communication. He spent some time at the University of Queensland, and he's retired now, but he's very, very active. He appears on a lot of different podcasts. And for some reason, he's dropped out at the moment. We're just waiting for him to reconnect. I don't know what's happened there, but I guess that's the whole thing with live streaming. You can get some technical difficulties. All right, everyone, we're going to give it another go. I've got Professor Louw back. We had some technical difficulties, so we haven't been able to live stream this one, but hopefully you do enjoy this conversation that I am going to have with Eric now. You obviously have been on the show before. You're back on episode 88 where we're talking about apartheid. And I thought I'd get you back on this time around because I reached out to you to talk about some of the issues that we've been discussing a little bit on the podcast of late. And it's all revolving around World War II and what impact that had on Western civilization. Obviously, the amount of people that died during that time would have had an effect on populations. Obviously, the collapse of the British Empire that came as a result of World War I and World War II. And also, the rise of America and also the rise of the Soviet Union as well. So you've written a book on this, and I just reached out to you thinking that you'd have an opinion, and you shared this book with me, The Roots of the Pax Americana, that you wrote a few years ago. So I guess I'm going to give the floor to you, Professor Louw. When it comes to World War II and even the events that happened before the war, World War I, the Great Depression, things like that, set the table. What's your theory when it comes to the result of World War II, the collapse of the British Empire, and also the rise of America?
Okay, well, what I try to do in that particular book, the book happened by accident. I was looking for something else, and while researching this other topic, I discovered there was a State Department committee. Well, it was actually 3 State Department committees that was set up in 1941. So that's before America entered the war. And the State Department, this was Roosevelt's State Department, they started these committees to advise the president on what America wanted after the war. What sort of world did they want? And these were secret committees. They're not secret anymore. So now you can go to the archives and you can read the minutes of these things, which is then what I did. And I was absolutely amazed. I was gobsmacked when I read these things, because basically what it came down to was that Roosevelt's comment was something. He said this. He said, it's going to be easy to knock out the German Empire. It's going to be easy to knock out the Japanese Empire. Our problem is, how do we get rid of the British Empire? The British are big and powerful, and they're not going to go away with any great ease. And, of course, they get in the way. So what the Americans wanted to do, and this goes back to Woodrow Wilson. In fact, if you track it all the way back, they wanted to establish an informal empire, which is what we have now. Pax Americana is an informal empire as opposed to the European model of a formal empire. But wherever the Americans went between the 2 wars, when they were trying to set up their informal empire, the Brits had got there first. The Brits had every good bit of territory in the whole world. And because this really annoyed the Americans terribly. And so these committees were planning committees as to how do we get rid of this problem. And their problem was, how do we get rid of the European empires? How do we get rid of the British? In particular, how do we get rid of the British Empire? And this is what Roosevelt's foreign policy was working toward. Now, the British were well aware of that. The British knew what was going on. In fact, it started with an address. Roosevelt used to do a lot of kite flying. He never actually announced things himself because he didn't want to annoy people. He would let somebody else fly the kite and then see what kind of reaction came out of this. And he used his Undersecretary of State to make a speech at the Norwegian embassy in Washington in 1941. This was a guy called Sumner Welles, who was a really serious lefty. And Sumner Welles personally disliked empires and disliked European empires, and particularly disliked the British Empire. And he was pushing really hard on the Americans getting rid of these empires. So he made this speech at the Norwegian Empire. If you read it on its surface level, he was issuing a threat to Germany and Japan, saying, we don't like your imperialism, we're going to come get you. But actually, everybody understood that he was actually talking to London. He was talking to Churchill and saying, we're coming, boy. You better shut down your empire. We're going to come get you. And in fact, Churchill understood this to the extent that Churchill then made a speech where he said, I did not become the first minister to demolish the British Empire, and I will never shut down the British Empire. And that started the whole battle. And it really was a battle. Okay, the next step in this thing was in fact the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter happens in 1940. It's an absolutely crucial moment in world history. In other words, the narrative, the normal narrative we get of the Second World War is one that says Churchill accidentally got into the war, and which actually, by the way, I think I agree with that idea. I think it was a shocking decision on Churchill's part, and we can discuss why I think he did that. But I think Churchill made a terrible mistake. And I'm pretty sure that at the end of his life, he was horrified because he was the guy who brought the British Empire down. There's no doubt about it. It was a shocking decision. Now, when this happened is the Americans started to put pressure on the Brits. The British are in trouble. The Germans are winning the war. And it looks like they're going to beat the Brits. Churchill is going to Washington, or his ambassador's going there and saying, you've got to help us. We're going to lose unless you guys come help us. And what happens is that the State Department and Roosevelt's team are saying, yeah, looks that's pretty much the way it looks to us, dude. You're in big trouble, dude. You're not going to win this. But we're not going to come help you. We are not going to help you until you promise you're going to shut down your empire. And there's all this correspondence that goes on in London. Every single head of department in the British civil service is saying to Churchill, do not sign anything to say you're going to give the empire. Just don't do it. Don't agree to it. Don't agree to it verbally. Just keep saying no. The Americans keep putting pressure on, and eventually Churchill it would appear to me, if you read between the lines, I think he was summoned to this meeting. The meeting happened on battleships off the coast of Canada, off the coast of Nova Scotia, where the president, Roosevelt and Churchill meet, and they discuss the whole issue. And this is where, on these battleships, Roosevelt presents to Churchill the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter, when agreed to by Churchill, says we are going to shut the empire down. Now, that appears to have been the condition for getting Lend-Lease. The British couldn't win the war without Lend-Lease. The Americans were not going to give them a damn thing until they agreed to shut the empire down. That's what happened. I mean, there's a whole long story, even at the end of the war, when the Brits try and back out of it a bit, and they get told, no, sorry, dude, this is what's happening. You're shutting down. What the Americans wanted was the Indian Empire. The Americans were interested in three places. They were interested in China, they were interested in Indonesia, they were interested in Britain. That's what they were interested in. And they kind of, and the Brits, so they knocked the Dutch out of Indonesia using very dirty tricks, exactly the same thing. They did the same to the Brits in India. So at the end of the war, when the Americans go, it's time to give independence to India now, Churchill then said, no, it's not working like that. And they said, dude, here's Lend-Lease. And there was a date on the Lend-Lease thing whereby, and that date, the British had to pay back all the money to the Brits. The British negotiator was Maynard Keynes, Lord Maynard Keynes. He was horrified at the Americans. He said, hey, remember when we had these meetings? You told me we were cousins. We were on the same team. You told me this would never happen. And they said, here's the bit of paper. Here's a contract. You signed it. That's it. On this piece of paper, it says on this date, you pay back all this money. Now, sorry, pay it back on that date or we come for you. And if you don't want us to demand that, it would have shut the whole British economy down. So if you don't want us to shut your economy down, that's the date you give independence to India. That's exactly what happened. And of course, that was the beginning of the end. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that as well. But once you shut down the Indian part of the empire, the British used the Indian army to police the whole empire. Once you don't have the Indian army, you can't police your empire anymore. And the Americans knew that all perfectly well. So they were just running a dirty little campaign, really.
Well, this is in contrast to what we're led to believe. We talk about, or what we're taught in history is that the Americans were... Sorry?
Yeah, that we're cousins and we're the best mates in the world, yeah.
But not only just that the Americans were reluctant to get involved in World War I, they were reluctant to get involved in World War II. What you're saying is even in 1941, they had plans.
They knew perfectly well. I think Roosevelt knew exactly what he was doing, yeah. He was a cunning guy. And I mean, you must also understand that, and it's something I didn't know until I started researching this book and I got so interested. Once I came across this committee, I thought, good grief, I didn't know this. And then I started going back and checking out Roosevelt, and particularly his wife. His wife was a serious lefty. I mean, she was really a serious lefty. And I think she had an enormous impact on the dude. But I mean, he also was pretty left-wing. And when he came in with the New Deal, there's a lot of, I mean, I found books written on it now where it says every lefty in America just poured into Washington. They were so thrilled when Roosevelt arrived. And it wasn't just his staffers. His own staffers were, of course, lefties. But what he did is he filled up the whole civil service with lefty guys. He filled up the State Department with lefties. And so the policy just shifted in America. And it was all about this decolonization. So what, in fact, Roosevelt does, well, he actually uses Cordell Hull, who's the Secretary of State, and he uses Sumner Welles, who's the Assistant Secretary of State. And even after the British sign off on this, on the Atlantic Charter, they keep up the pressure. The Americans keep up the pressure, and it's all about decolonization. Roosevelt invents the notion of decolonization. He invents the notion of anti-colonialism. And the American propaganda machine, during the war, they had the Office of War Information. And during the war, this Office of War Information pumped out fantastic amounts of really hostile material about the European empire, saying that all the stuff we hear now, all that stuff that we now hear all the time about how evil the British Empire was, all the bad things they do to the natives, it's unacceptable, it's terrible. It all came from the American propaganda machine. And in fact, there's a point where I found this wonderful quote from Roosevelt, where I can't remember the exact date, but it was toward the end of the war when he said, we've won, because they put all this energy, and Roosevelt's propaganda team were particularly focused on universities and they were focused on journalists. They said, well, we can get all the academics on our team and we can get all the journalists on our team, we've won the battle. So we have to, and they focused on British journalists, particularly, or journalists across the British Empire, but particularly in London. They wanted to recruit them and make them think that empire was bad, imperialism was bad, colonialism was bad, the British Empire was an evil thing. And they were pushing these things. Chatham House, I'm sure you know, Chatham House is still a think tank in London. Chatham House was a black propaganda operation that the Americans were paying for. They had another one in Hawaii, which today is called the East-West Center. And that's how they contacted all the intellectuals. And they were just pumping out this anti-colonial stuff, which then got into the system. And of course, we see where it's all gone to now. So ironically, Roosevelt starts this decolonization idea, this ideology. And after the war, it keeps mutating, it keeps growing, because it has become part of the academic discourse and it's become part of the journalistic discourse. And so it mutates into a kind of a self-delegitimating ideology that comes back to bite the West. In fact, it comes back to bite America itself. That's one of the great ironies. But I don't think Roosevelt understood that was where it was going to head to.
Can you just paint the picture of Roosevelt a little bit, because he's unique in terms of presidents? He served 4 terms, which is not able. From 1933, the end of the Great Depression, to World War II, a very significant time in world history, not just American history, but it's unique in itself that he was able to serve 4 terms. That he had more time than anyone to bring in his reform. So do you want to expand on Roosevelt himself? I know you talked about him being on the left, but how significant was that he was in there for so long?
Well, of course, he was. His policy was the New Deal, which is it's a social. He was a social democrat. He's bringing in socialism into America and bringing into the welfare. He was building the beginnings of the welfare system in America. So you could say that this terrible debt that America now has, Roosevelt's the guy who started this, and he was very successful because, this was after the Great Depression, and so Americans are hurting. There's some really people in bad way. And of course, in a sense, he was a populist. He actually went to these guys and said, "Hey, vote for me and I'll fix it and I'll just shovel the money out and the jobs to you guys." And that's essentially what the New Deal did. So it's one of the reasons he could stay in power. It's a little bit like we're heading into that state now, where as the economy slows down, people want to hear the Labour Party here saying, "We love you. We're the good guys. We'll come give you money." That's how Roosevelt stayed in power for so long. But he also had this other international agenda. But as I said, the international agenda, it seems to me, was more his wife's agenda. She was pushing that one. She wanted the empires to go down really badly, but she genuinely thought they were evil. And in fact, Roosevelt's on record as saying as well that he thought the British Empire was evil.
So my question to you, you're talking about Roosevelt and these American forces that want to pull down the British Empire, but are there forces within the British Empire itself? Because it's still a big force. It's still got Australia and New Zealand and all these African countries. And it's still got a lot of land and wealth.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. I don't think I agree with that idea that Churchill made a mistake. I think Churchill's decision I do think Churchill's decision to go into the war was a mistake, and it is responsible for bringing the empire down. Now, of all the people that I can think of, I think Churchill was probably the most committed politician to the empire that ever existed. He loved the empire. And I often wonder what he must have thought in his old age, like when he got to the late 50s and early 60s. Did he sit down and go, "Oh my gosh, what have I done?" Because it was a shocking decision. If you go back, as I have done, I've gone and looked at that part, in 1938, 39. Churchill was in British politics deemed a warmonger. He wanted to go to war. He just, and in fact, the bulk of the British ruling establishment did not want to go to war with Germany. They were arguing against this, particularly the British aristocracy, particularly the conservatives. They were going, "Why would we go to war against Hitler?" Because Hitler's basic argument was, "I love the British." He regarded the British as a fellow German people, so you're on our team. So my understanding is that Churchill had said to the British Foreign Office, "Leave me alone. I'm off to Russia. I want an empire. You've got an empire. I want an empire. My empire is going to be." He wanted Poland and Russia as his empire. You let me have that. I don't touch your empire. I leave you guys all alone. So just leave me alone and we can share the world. That's what he basically said.
And there's a lot of evidence to support that. He was making a lot of, even once the war had started, he was making a lot of overtures to the British to say, let's
stop this thing. Let's stop the war. Yeah, he didn't, because he realized this was going to get in the way of his Russian war, as it did. So I think Churchill made a mistake. Now, I've wondered, why would he do that? Was it just that it was a bad move? His wife, his mother was American, and I'm not sure that didn't have an effect. He saw the Americans, his mother was American. He would have had American family. He clearly thought, these are our buddies. These are our best mates. even though all the memos coming to him from intelligence, coming to him from the Foreign Office, coming to him from the Colonial Office, they were all saying to him, the Americans are out to get us. And you've got to understand this. I mean, some of the more interesting documents that I saw.
They knew about this? That they knew that.
Absolutely. In fact, there was some fascinating, just a lot of fascinating traffic from the intelligence department. British intelligence was saying, they were sending this information to him, and they said, the Americans have activists actively working in India trying to wind the Indians up against us. Here is the evidence. It's going on all the time. They are exacerbating, they're creating the problem. They are trying to bring the empire down. They're not just talking to us, not just diplomatic. They've got people in the field in Britain who are operating out of Hawaii, by the way. So what's now called the East-West Center was America's it was there where they targeted the British Empire in Asia. They were interested in the British Empire in Asia becoming theirs. Okay, so you had to bring it down. So they were stirring up the natives. Churchill knew this.
Is this a clash in ideology, or does this go back to the War of Independence, where the Americans were still hostile to the British?
Yeah, I've spoken to other academics about this. I mean, people that work in this area, and they say, there is just an American thing which goes back to that. The American War because the American War of Independence, and it's never portrayed to us like that either, but the American War of Independence was a civil war. Half of the colonists in the 13 colonies wanted to stay British. They were British. We don't want to be independent. And the other half wanted independence. So it was actually Americans fighting each other. And the British army went over to help. Obviously, the Brits were on their side. So it wasn't like every single American was anti-British or wanted independence. But obviously, and then of course, what happened is once the pro-independence Americans won the war, and the British leave, all of those Americans who were pro-British, who didn't want independence, they were the ones that moved to Canada, which is how Canada starts.
Yeah, right. Wow. Because they talk about how when the war started, it was only like 25% of the Americans that actually pushed for independence. It was a small group of them.
Absolutely.
It wasn't overwhelming at all.
And curiously enough, if you look at the ones that were pushing for independence, it was the business class, because it was tax. So I mean, the history is very weird. It's because. There's the Americans. It's Washington starts the war by accident. He's having a war against the French, and he winds up the Indian tribes in what is now, I think it's Ohio. It's that part of what is now America. That used to be part of French North America. Washington goes there and accidentally starts a war between America and the French and all these Indians, and it becomes a terrible war, and it spreads all over the eastern frontier. At this point, the Americans can't win the war, so the British have to go in there to help their colonist guys to pacify the whole area and put the French back in their place and put the Indian tribes back in their place. So they do this, and it costs the British a fortune. But the British win that war. Having won the war, they say to the Brits, well, you never paid for this war. We paid for this war. We want some of our money back. And the way we're going to get the money back is we're going to put a tax on tea coming into America to recover some of the costs. And of course, that was the Boston Tea Party. So it was the business guys in America who go, no, we don't, it's just no representation without, no tax without representation thing. But that's the story what happened. But it certainly wasn't all Americans that wanted to be independent. But of course, the ones that took over the government, the Washington team, the guys that became Americans, they had this thing. They had to build up a narrative, of course, to say, empires are bad, the British Empire is bad, and build up that whole story, which then becomes part of their founding myth. So, I think that played into it as well, yeah.
But we're talking about Roosevelt and Churchill, but Roosevelt dies in April 1945. Churchill loses the July 1945 election. So once you get to that tail end of the war, both of those leaders are gone.
And by the way, the losing the election thing, when Churchill lost the election, I mean, that the Americans have a hand in that as well. So
really?
Absolutely. During the war, during the war itself, the Americans have this thing called the Office of War Information, which is their propaganda department. And the Americans, during the war, the American army goes all over the place. They come to Australia. They go to Britain. I mean, millions. We're talking millions. I mean, it's 1 million Americans in Britain, okay? And they also go to India. Large numbers of Americans go to India. And what they do is the Office of War Information, the propaganda guys, go with the army because they're in the army. When they get there, their brief is, so in Australia, their brief was, get hold of working class Australians and say to them, the British Empire sucks. The British Empire is a bad thing. The British Empire is repressing black people, just like they repress you as the working class here. And it worked. They did the same thing in Britain. They went to the British working class and said, how can you put up with this aristocracy and this ruling family and this imperial shit with they're repressing black people all over the world? You should be ashamed of yourselves. Your masters are not just bad to you, they're bad to the whole world. And that's one of the reasons that the Labour Party won in Britain. In fact, during the war, Roosevelt changed his ambassador in Britain and put in a kind of an American lefty trade union type guy who had strong contacts with the British Labour Party. And throughout the war, they were working on this. Like, how do we put the messages in? How do we get the British public to vote against the Conservative Party after, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, that's what was going on, yeah. And in India as well, the Office of War Information guys were winding up the Indians saying, you got to demand independence. You can't put up with this shit. So they were working at it from both ends. So in London itself, they were trying to get the British ruling class to become embarrassed about the empire, and that was working on the intellectuals, on the academics, and some of the journalists, and that worked. But they're also working at the underclass, at the working class level, getting, why are you putting up with these Conservative Party guys? They're bad, and look what they're doing all over the world. They're repressing people.
And all the while, this upheaval was taking place. I mean, we brought it up on the podcast last week. I'll bring it up now. The amount of people that were dying during the two wars. I mean, this is taking place during World War II. This is the amount, Soviet Union had 24 to 27 million casualties and deaths. Germany lost 7 to 9 million people. It just goes on and on and
catastrophic.
on. There's catastrophic death taking place across all these countries. So that's upheaval in their societies, because suddenly people, in their towns, the postman's not there anymore because he's dead. He went off to war. The headmaster's not there anymore.
I mean, Europe was devastated. Europe was absolutely devastated by this thing. Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the deaths; it's the entire infrastructure was wrecked.
Yeah.
I mean, it truly was a shocking war for Europe.
Yeah. So it was really ripe for America to come in and I guess stir the pot.
I think that was Roosevelt's plan all along. He wanted this to happen.
So obviously I brought up how Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. How does this carry on after the war? We've seen a lot of death, a lot of upheaval during the war. He dies. He's out of the way. How does it carry on?
Well, okay. So, I mean, what happens is that it's those committees that I discovered. You see, those committees planned what the war was, what the world would look like. And the world that they were planning was that the European empires would be gone, because make them go, and we'll replace them with what we eventually saw, which is the Pax Americana, which is an informal empire. Now, an informal empire works on the basis of multilateralism. So Americans don't annex territory. They want these countries to be independent, but they're not properly independent. And these countries, then, Americans have their own little, their allies in each of these countries that kind of help them run the empire. All right, and they use multilateralism. So they use organizations like the United Nations. In fact, one of the committees in the State Department was the committee that drew up the model of the United Nations. They designed it, they put it in place. UNESCO was another organization they did. The World Trade Organization, the World Bank, all of those things, they were all designed by the State Department. They were American institutions. As long as the Americans write the rules of the institution, they govern the world. That's how it works. As simple as that. It's a brilliant system now. And the model originally comes from Woodrow Wilson. He was the guy way back in the 1900s when he was president. He said America has to get into the imperial business, but we shouldn't get into the business that the Europeans in. We shouldn't build formal empires because they're ugly. We build this other kind of empire, which doesn't look like an empire, but it's our empire, and we rule. It's a rules-based system. It's exactly the thing that Trump is taking to pieces now. It's like Trumpists have worked out this was a bad thing, and Trump is now trying to take to pieces the very model that Roosevelt put into place. And this carried on after the war because the State Department had the plans in place. It was all laid out. They knew exactly what they were going to roll out.
We're talking about the British Empire, but at the same time, the same thing's happening in Germany with the Nazification. Oh, exactly.
And in Japan, they do the same awful things.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable. If you look at the stuff that they do in Germany and you look at the stuff they do to the Japanese, it's outrageous. I mean, people think the concentration camps in Germany closed after the war. They didn't. The Americans kept them open and put the Nazis in there and kept them there for years. The Russians took all their Germans, took them off and put them in the Gulag in Russia and worked them for whatever it was, 15 years as slave labor. I mean, it was not a pleasant thing that happened after the war. 12 million Germans got expelled from Eastern Europe, the largest single mass movement of refugees in the world ever. 12 million got kicked out of Eastern Europe and sent back to Germany. It was staggering the stuff that went on.
And not only that, they're starving at the same time. I mean, I've listened to diary accounts of Germans and Russians and British after the war.
It's terrible.
Decade, 10, 15 years, they were starving.
Awful. Yeah.
On rations.
That's how they got the Dutch to give away Indonesia. The Dutch didn't want to leave Indonesia. So the Dutch went back after the war, okay? And they reoccupied the place. Because the Dutch could easily have held on to Indonesia, just as the British could easily have held on to India. What happens is that the Americans say to the Dutch, dudes, get out of Indonesia, give it independence now. And the Dutch say, no, we're not going to do that. Now, at the end of the war, one of the things the Germans did is they opened all the sluice gates. They flooded Holland, basically, to stop the British and the army and the American army getting there. Now, when they did this, because this devastates Holland, the Dutch economy is gone, and the Dutch are starving. And the Dutch send a message to the Dutch saying, you got a choice. You can keep your empire in Indonesia if that's what you want. But if you want us to come and feed you and bail you out of the shit you're in, the Indonesia gets its independence on that date. That's how it works. Did the same thing there.
And at the same time, or a little bit later, once you get into the 60s and 70s, it starts happening in Africa as well.
Well, in fact, if you look at what they did in Algeria, it was disgraceful. I mean, it's why the French have never forgiven the Brits, ever. And they tried the same to the Portuguese. They do it to everybody. You must all get out of your empires. And of course, the Algerian War, and by the way, the Algerian War becomes very important in creating this decolonization thing that's affecting us in Australia now. So all the stuff about the decolonization, this new discourse that's floating around, it very much gets developed by French academics, plus a guy called Fanon, who was a Marxist academic in Algeria, who invent this post-colonial discourse, which has now come back to bite us. So they pick up Roosevelt's decolonization thing and kind of put it on steroids. And that comes back to bite us now. So the Algerian War, de Gaulle just refuses to get out. The French say Algeria is France because there are 1.2 million Frenchmen living in Algeria. Now, it's a lot of people. And they're French citizens. And they get to vote for the French parliament. They have members of parliament in France. And they just go, we're not leaving Algeria. Algeria is France. Bugger off. And they fight this terrible war there until the Americans finally put the pressure on de Gaulle so heavily that he backs down. I don't know what they did to the dude, but they did it in 1958. So when I looked at the record in 1958, something happened in 1958 where suddenly the Americans got something over de Gaulle and he backed down. He just backed down like that.
Well, the same thing happened.
Yeah.
The same thing happened in Rhodesia with Ian Smith.
Yes,
the
exactly.
British were telling him, you can't be independent. You have to give over rule. And he's resisting. And then suddenly Kissinger and the Americans come in.
And say it's all over. Yeah, they do the same Algeria is the first one. The next one they do this to is Kenya. And the model is the same. If you look at the model in Kenya, they go through exactly the same process. They hammer the hell out of these guys. They find a guy who's on their team, and eventually they just say, "Hey, it's all over." I'm just telling you, it's packing up now. In Kenya, it was slightly different because finally what they did there is the Brits went in and they paid all the farmers to sell their farms. That's how they got them out of Kenya. That was the final move. Then the next one was the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland, and they put incredible pressure on Zelensky. So Zelensky was the prime minister of Rhodesia and Iceland. He actually came from northern Rhodesia, from what is now Zambia. So he put up a hell of a fight as well. And eventually they said, it's in both his book and in the book of the British guy who negotiated with him. And when the British took the final message to Zelensky, the guy flew to Salisbury, sat down in Zelensky's office, and he said, "It's all over. It's all over. We are pulling the plug on you guys now. So just shut it down now. We're not asking you. We're telling you. Americans have told us to tell you it's all over." And when this message was delivered, Zelensky said he got up, went to the toilet, and threw up. And the British negotiator did the same thing.
But if the Americans want to install this new empire, and they want to do it by stealth, it's not openly an empire like it is in Britain and other places, wouldn't they want to still hold on to countries like South Africa, Rhodesia, India? Why do they want to hand them over to the local populations? I mean, you can see, I've got this clip here. This is a contrast between Rhodesia in the 1970s, which was still under the rule of Ian Smith, and I suppose you would say white rule, and what Zimbabwe looks like now. And it's a complete contrast. And it's terrible. It's a terrible decline in that country. Yep. How does this benefit the Americans, or is this just something that got out of their control?
I personally think the Americans are incredibly naive. It's as simple as that. Americans just do not understand others, and they sure didn't understand Africa. I don't think they understood the third world. They just got it wrong. They thought it would all just be, they just thought these guys would just be like them, and it would all just work out okay. But because it didn't work out okay. You would think at some point they worked out. Well, maybe Trump worked it out now, but it's taken the Americans a long time to work it out.
So this I guess guilt tripping that is taking place in the West. Now it's spread everywhere. It's in Australia, it's in New Zealand, it's in Canada, it's now in the UK. We're taught that colonialisation is bad. We're taught to hate ourselves. White people are bad. Are you making the argument this came from America? This idea? Yep.
I'm saying that I can track it out. I can track the discourse. I've always been fascinated by this. In my academic careers, I'm fascinated by how ideas move through space and time. They move from person to. It's like a virus. They literally go, it's like a virus, and it spreads from one brain to the next. And every time it gets changed just slightly. And it mutates as it goes along. Now, with the decolonization discourse, it's unambiguous, no question. Roosevelt's team invent that idea, and there's actually a moment. I found the point at which, and it's also the idea of development. We've got this idea of third world development and US aid, and of course the Australians also got into this. The whole idea of development was invented at the same time as decolonization. For Roosevelt's team, decolonization and development are two sides of the same coin. They are the same thing. So what you do is, decolonization is you get the European empires to shut down. It's about transferring sovereignty. So the original meaning of decolonization means the British and the French and the Portuguese and etc., they hand sovereignty back to the local inhabitants. That's the meaning. That's the original meaning of decolonization. But that's not the meaning of decolonization anymore. It's shifted. Because then what happens is it gets into the works, and in fact, In the 1950s, that is the definition. It's about transferring sovereignty. And during the 1950s, particularly from 1958 onwards, the Americans really ratcheted up the pressure. And that's what they're saying to all of the European colonial powers. You have got so many years, and I think they gave them like 3 or 4 years to be out of there. You give them independence, these are the dates, work out a timetable and make it happen. Now, that was the original meaning. But then, of course, the Americans lose control of the process. And one of the reasons the Americans lose control of the process is that they actually lose control during the Second World War. The Americans were incredibly naive and stupid in the Second World War. They built up the Soviet Union to smash the Germans. And that might seem very... The Russians could not have beaten Germany without all the aid that the Americans gave to them. The Americans gave far more aid to the Russians than they ever gave to the British. Phenomenal amounts of material. That's what the war was won on, was American aid being given to the Russians. Now, it didn't seem to occur to Washington that if you completely obliterate Germany, I mean, the stupidity was to say you have to surrender. It's like just nothing. You can't negotiate. We give you nothing. We want to break you down to zero. Now, that was stupid, because if you're going to take the Germans back to zero and then build up the Russians at the same time, what the hell did the Americans think was going to happen? They were creating a power vacuum in Europe, and of course the Russians just walked in. Boom. I mean, no one to stop them. So now suddenly now the Americans have the problem that Europe is divided in two, and the Soviets are phenomenally powerful because the Americans made them phenomenally powerful. Just as the Americans...
This is the whole stupidity of it all.
Yeah, they're amazingly dumb.
You look at Poland, I mean, that's a clear example.
Absolutely.
Britain, the excuse for Britain to go to war was to protect Poland.
And then they give it away.
They give it away.
They give it away. And I mean, the bizarre thing is, and in fact, Poland, of course, was a particularly stupid one for Britain to do. I mean, I understand there's a connection there between the Polish ruling class and the British ruling class, liked each other, etc. But nonetheless, it's one of those funny ones where the Germans actually had a point there. I mean, after the Second World War, they took a whole bunch of Prussia and gave it to Poland. Yeah. And Hitler's saying, I want it back. It's mine. Why? I didn't agree to this. So, in fact, there's a sort of sense in which the Germans are going, well, it's ours. We're just taking it back. Okay. Now, if they had attacked Germany when Germany attacks Russia, where they've got no particular reason to, and it's just pure imperialism. Yeah, I mean, I can get that. Then you can say there's an argument to do that. But that's not when they go to war. They go to war when Germany is saying, we're taking Danzig back. It's our city. It's ours. And then the British go to war. But at the end of the war, they don't give Poland independence anyway. So you kind of wonder, well, what was that all about? I mean, I think at the end, at Yalta, Churchill had worked out how bad things were, and he was trying to stop it. But by then, the Roosevelt and Stalin were just telling Churchill, drop dead. We don't have to listen to you, dude. Yeah, and they just divided up the world amongst them,
So people are going to ask, I mean, they always talk about the Lima Agreement, which was taking manufacturing from Western countries and handing it over basically to third world countries. Is that part of this plan? Like, you know?
No, you see, no. It's actually, what the Americans do is they create an informal empire, but they can never quite get it together because the Soviets get in the way. So the original plan, the plan that they designed in the Second World War for the Pax Americana is that America would run the entire world. Okay, but they'd run it through this informal mechanism of multilateralism. Then they've accidentally built up the Soviets who come along, and that's what the Cold War is. So the Cold War is a period when you now have two great powers, and they're kind of balancing each other. So the Americans only own half the world, and they can never quite roll out what they want. That all changes when the Berlin Wall comes down. The Berlin Wall changes everything. And when the Berlin Wall comes down, suddenly the Americans can actually implement the Pax Americana as planned in 1945. Well, in 1942, actually. And that's when they start rolling it out. And you see that. Immediately that happens, the Americans are going, democratization. All of you guys have to govern yourselves exactly as we tell you. And they went around the world telling everybody what to do. Like, we're the boss now. You just do what we tell you. Everywhere, right across the world. And they started acting like a quite nasty hegemon, using exactly the way it was supposed to work, where you can use multilateralism to get your own way.
So fast forward to where we're at now. Is I mean, you talk about wokeism and hatred of the West, hatred of ourselves. Is this just the end result? I mean, I
think it's as a result of a whole bunch of. It's not a plan. It's not like Washington planned all these bad things, because bad things are happening to Washington now. It's like it got out of control. And I think one of the things that happened was during the Algerian War, a fellow came along by the name of Frantz Fanon, came from the Caribbean, a black guy from one of the French islands in the Caribbean. He's a doctor. He's a psychologist. And in the Algerian War, he joins the French army because he's from French Caribbean. But he's a black guy. When he gets to Algeria, he changes sides. He becomes a Marxist, and he decides, hell no, this French Empire is bad. This war is bad. I'm on the other team. And he crosses sides and joins the Algerian guerrillas. Okay? And he comes up with a model. The book is called The Wretched of the Earth. It's one of the most influential books in Marxism in the 20th century, by far. Had an enormous impact. And the basic argument in the book is that European colonialism is so evil that it drives the colonized, brown people, black people, Arabs, it drives them mad. And Fanon says, so he's a Marxist, he's converted to Marxism now, and he goes like, I don't just want a revolution the way other Marxists want a revolution. He's saying the revolutions that happen in the third world are special revolutions now. Because there, the only way, he says, the natives can ever recover their sense of being human beings is that they have to kill white people. They must actually commit an act of killing a white person, and that will liberate them, and then they will be free of this feeling of inferiority. That's his basic argument. And it becomes incredibly influential. Fanon's book becomes the Bible of all third world revolutions after that, of all the decolonization thing, etc. But worse than that, it gets picked up by French Marxists like Sartre in Paris. And Sartre and the French intellectuals make it a very sexy book. In fact, the 1968 revolution in Paris is based on this thing, on this Fanon exercise, okay? And of course, all the kind of what we now call the wokies, okay, all the woke, they latch onto Fanon, and they now want to be part of this. They can't be part of the third world revolution, but they can help the third world revolution. They can help all these little brown people recover their sense of humanity. And this becomes the new definition of decolonization. Decolonization is not what Roosevelt wanted now. Now it's a Marxist revolution of a particular kind. And this idea then mutates into a new theory called post-colonialism. Post-colonialism catches on, in particular in American universities. Fanon goes across to the American universities, together with the other guy was a Palestinian, oddly enough, by the name of Edward Said. And Edward Said writes a book called Orientalism. And these two books, Orientalism and Wretched of the Earth, they bring them together at American universities. So your lefty academics in American universities bring them together, and they produce post-colonialism, which is this new theory, the one we've still got. And that's the one that's been applied ever since. To show you how influential it is, okay, Obama referred to Fanon. Obama, when he was the president of America, referred to Fanon's book. He referred to a Marxist book as a wonderful book and as something you should follow. What does that tell you? Okay, so it's just been there forevermore since then. It got in. Now, that's obviously not what, even if Roosevelt might have been lefty, I don't think that's what he ever had in mind. But that's what we ended up with. It's become this mutated thing that it's metastasized into something else. And of course, this decolonization thing, it then gets into sort of kind of weird story. It gets locked into a new discipline that spreads around particularly Anglo universities called cultural studies. Now, cultural studies is something that is started in a British university by a Caribbean migrant to Britain. One of those Caribbean migrants who goes to Britain in the 1950s, also a black guy. And he becomes a professor of English at a British university. And he uses this to invent this new thing called cultural studies, which is neo-Marxism. It's he invents new Marxism. He says the old Marxism and Stalinism is a bad thing. We must invent a new humanist kind of Marxism, which is what Hall sets about doing, and that is cultural studies, basically. Cultural studies goes over to the American universities, where it mixes with Fanon and with Said and produces this terrible monster that we've now created. And it infects basically every single English university in the world. It just takes over the Anglo world. It's everywhere. It's in every Australian university. And it's prominent. It's not like some marginal thing. It's dominates the faculties of humanities and social sciences in Australian universities, in British universities, in American universities, in Canadian universities. And of course now they spread. Then I saw what happened. Yeah, I worked at the University of Queensland. I saw this idea of post-colonialism. Okay, it infected two different other degrees that became catastrophic for our society. One, it infected the education departments. So the education departments used to not be in universities. Used to go to teachers' training colleges, and where you were trained to be a teacher. And when the Dawkins reforms happened, they brought these colleges into the universities. It was a disaster for all of us. I mean, if you ask me, one of the things that destroys Western civilization, there it is. Because all these teachers come into the universities, and I saw this happen in South Africa too, it happened in Britain, happened in all the Anglo universities. And these poor guys that came from the teachers' training colleges, who now suddenly found themselves in universities, they weren't treated like proper academics. The proper academics said, "You're not an academic, bloody teacher. What do you know about theory or anything? You know nothing." And they were really nasty to them. Now, these guys have to prove that they actually are proper academics. And it was just that moment when post-colonialism and cultural studies arrived, and they latched onto these theories, and these theories got into the education department. They all got converted to it, and they taught every single teacher ever since then this crazy stuff. The other place it got into was journalism. Journalism never used to be taught at universities. Journalism used to be taught in-house. Like when I learned to be a journalist, I never went to university. I joined a newspaper, and I just followed another journalist around. It's like an apprenticeship system, and that's how you learn to be a journalist. Now, that worked well because it meant you had every newspaper had a different editorial style. You had lots of different kinds of journalists. When you brought it into the universities now, and basically Rupert Murdoch, I'm afraid, was to blame there. Rupert Murdoch decided he was going to outsource training to the universities. He didn't want to pay for it himself anymore. So he said, "No, I'm not training journalists anymore. No, somebody else must do this." And he shunted it off to the universities. Big mistake, because it got into the universities at exactly the moment that cultural studies and post-colonialism happened. Bang, gets into the journalism schools. They teach it to every journalist. Now journalists are spread it everywhere. And between teachers and journalists, this new bastardized version of decolonization has just gone wild. It's like a new religion. It's like a secular religion that's happened. And we can all see what's happened with it.
Yeah. This is a map of the height of the British Empire. This is from 1919, where you can see it's just spread across the world. And they used to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire. That's gone. That's all swept away, and it's been swept away because of a lot of the things that you've been discussing today. And we're at the point we're at now, where a lot of this stuff is just festering in the universities. I mean, how do we turn this all around? I know I'm probably going to get attacked by people that say, "Well, you're supporting the colonial system," but it did bring a lot of stability in some ways.
I mean, the idea that the empires were completely evil and bad, as I said, that was Rooseveltian propaganda, and it's actually propaganda. I mean, if you're a propagandist, you're not going to pick the nice things; you're going to pick the bad things. And there's a lot of stories that they put out that are just plain wrong. You can demonstrate they're wrong. You can show they're empirically incorrect, but they caught on. Okay, now. And of course, now with this new post-colonial thing that we've got now, they've now got different targets. Under Roosevelt, it meant giving sovereignty, giving independence, transferring sovereignty from London to Nairobi. That's what it meant. Okay, doesn't mean that anymore. Now it's spread into the third world, where these guys said, Yes, but now that we've got our independence, the problem is in Kenya, in fact, it started in Kenya. It was a Kenyan guy. Two of the colonies that have become most influential in creating this post-colonial thing have been Kenya and India at their universities. And these academics in Kenya and in India latched onto this decolonization idea and transformed it by adding Fanon and by adding Said. And they said, yes, but even if we're independent, we're not properly independent because we've got all these terrible British ideas. I speak English. Shakespeare was the horrible English. We don't all this British stuff. They fought the fight. So, and they became negative about it. Yeah, we must tear this all down. So that's, and of course, then that's the next stage. It starts as we're going to change the curriculum in our universities and schools so we don't carry on teaching British and French and Portuguese things. Yeah? But then it mutates again because these guys, you can never give them enough. And the next thing that happens is they go, hang on, what about the settler colonies? Because they were left out of it completely. Under Roosevelt, they never spoke about knocking out Australia or Canada or even South Africa. Okay, I mean, South Africa was one of their allies, for God's sakes. So they never said we're going to get rid of white South Africans. That wasn't on the agenda. But once this idea starts to develop, particularly in India, the Indians are very prolific in this stuff. Their academics are phenomenally prolific. And which means that when you get Indian migrants moving to Australia or Britain, they take it with them. Believe me, they do. Mm. And these ideas then spread to, hang on, we don't just want to look at India or Zimbabwe or Nigeria or one of those places, which is a proper colony. Let's look at the settler colonies. Let's look at them too. Like, let's look at Australia. Let's look at Canada. Indeed, let's look at America because that's colonialism as well. And it's just as evil there. And a whole new genre of studies has emerged. Which is taught in Australia. There's a lot of these guys floating around in Australian universities now. They've invented a new thing. Believe it or not, you know what they call it? Unsettling settlers. Any white guy in Australia is a settler. Any white guy in Canada is a settler. You're descendant of settlers. They now want to unsettle the settlers. They want to make you feel bad. They want to make you feel guilty. They want you to give up. In fact, exactly what they did to the British. Okay, during the Second World War, Roosevelt said, if I can get the intellectuals in London to think that empires are evil and bad, they will take their own empire to pieces. And they did. They really did. That's what happened. He got the British intellectual class to put pressure on their own politicians, say this is evil and bad. Now they're doing it in Australia and in Canada and in America. Same thing. They're getting the intellectuals to spread the idea, you should be ashamed of yourself. Because you're these bad settlers and we're going to unsettle settlers. But then if you went to the next stage beyond that, then they say, hang on, we've never actually thought about the metropolitan countries. What about Britain and France and Belgium? They're just as goddamn evil. In fact, they did it. They mightn't be settlers, but they were at the heart of the exercise. We must go there and decolonize them as well. Now they want to decolonize Britain. Which is that we're going to change the curriculum of their schools and their university to teach them that they're evil bastards who did this terrible thing. And of course, how do you apologize for doing that? You know what they say? Stuart Hall was the guy who said it. He called it the Empire Strikes Back. And how do you think the Empire strikes back? You send little brown and black people to colonize the Britain and France. You take it over that way. And then what better? And it's the empire literally strikes back. And funnily enough, when Stuart Hall, was from Jamaica, and when Stuart Hall went to Britain and said he was taking this idea there, his mother, bless her heart, she's on record of saying, because she was very pro-British, she was a black pro-British settler. She was actually mixed race, okay, but she's living in Jamaica, and she identifies as British. And when Stuart Hall tells her what he's planning to do in Britain, she says, oh dear, my poor old mother England, what are you going to do? It's just, you couldn't make this stuff up.
So when you look at countries like Zimbabwe, who did have a percentage of white people there, now it's like 0 point nothing. Like the whites have gone. The whites are fleeing South Africa. We're seeing parts of London that are 0% white. It seems that the whites are being dispersed from these areas, and they're having to go somewhere. Has this been a plan all along, or is this what you're describing, where it was a plan, but now the plan has just gotten out of hand? It has been taken over. There's no real plan to attack white people and disperse white people, but that's the result of Roosevelt from the beginning trying to dismantle the British Empire.
You know, I don't think it's a plan, but I don't think it's like completely innocent as well. The person who the book that explained it to me best was a book by someone called Goddard called The Road to Somewhere. I don't know if you've read this book. It's a wonderful book. And in this book, Goddard in Britain, he tried to explain Brexit. It was a book in which he was trying to explain to himself, why did we have Brexit? And he divided the British public into what he called anywheres and somewheres. And what that means is, so a somewhere, a person who is a somewhere, belongs in a place. They are rooted in a place. Like, I am English. I belong in England. I love England. I'm an English person. This is where I belong. Okay, you're rooted somewhere, and you care about it. It's nationalism, okay? And anywhere is a cosmopolitan. It's an internationalist. You get two versions of somewheres. The socialist somewheres are internationalists. The liberal somewheres are cosmopolitans. But what they've acquired is this idea of globalization. They are globalists. And they believe that they are citizens of the world. Okay? I might be living in England, I might be living in London, but I'm not British. I'm not English. I'm a citizen of the world. And once you see these two kinds of people, it transformed my way of seeing the world. Once I saw this, you see them everywhere. I see them all the time. When I was at university of Queensland, it was like instantaneous. Like, you're somewhere, you're an anywhere. Okay? And the universities, of course, are full of anywheres. There are hardly any, there are no somewheres left there. Okay? They're all cosmopolitans or internationalists, and they believe in this global thing. And of course, that is of course what the Americans wanted. So that's part of the original Rooseveltian plan. Because if you're going to run your empire, you have a dispersed elite over the entire globe, all working on the same project. But what you all believe in is globalism.
But isn't that what the Soviets wanted as well? I mean, they didn't believe in the nation state; they believed in the.
Yeah, it's anti-nationalism. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then I'll tell you the other book that I think is fantastic. Goodart is the one book that I thought was amazingly useful. Once you see this anywhere, somewhere thing, once you see it, you can predict how a person's going to respond to anything. I know who you are, and they will always, the Trumpists are somewheres. I mean, that's why they're Trumpists. Yeah. And the Biden crew are anywheres. That's why they're Biden people. And you can just see. I mean, there it is. Okay, they don't give a shit about America. So that's why you'll have open borders. You just let anybody in. They just think that's a good idea. They honestly believe it's a good idea. I mean, if I'm a global citizen, I have no right to keep people out. This is not Australia for Australians. This is Australia because we're all part of the same world. Shame if you've got a starving African, let them in here and feed them. I mean, that's how anywhere sees the world. So it's a kind of new ideology which is caught on. And of course, it's caught on big time at the universities. I would have been one of the few somewheres when I was at the University of Queensland. Hell, there were not a lot of us around, I promise you. And the minute they thought that you weren't one of them, they would look at you askance, like there's something wrong with you. Now, the other book that explains, I thought brilliantly what's happened, is a book by Rusty Reno. What's called the Return of the Strong Gods. I really recommend this book. Fantastic book. And Reno's argument is that he's absolutely correct. Is that at the end of the Second World War, he says something called he calls it the post-war consensus emerged. And the post-war consensus was all about saying, never again. It must never allow this to happen again because it's so bad. Okay? And he tracks it to the idea of anti-authoritarianism. Anti-Nazis, anti-authoritarianism, anti-strong men, all that stuff that we hear about all the time now. So they look at the Nazis and they go, these guys are really bad. We must never allow this to happen again. And they spread this idea. So Reno says this consensus is spread around from there, okay, this never again idea. And he says that ever since then, we hear it all the time. I mean, once you see it, you go, my God, that's absolutely true. Like, it's as if, for these guys, it's as if the Second World War never ended. The Second World War ended 80 years ago. All the Nazis are dead. They're gone. I mean, they're not a threat to anybody. And yet, if you listen to the propaganda they keep churning out, you'd think the war was still going on. You still think that Hitler was going to come back tomorrow and take over the world.
Yeah.
And they keep saying, we must never allow this to happen. My God, they're going to come back. They're going to get us. Trump is a Hitler. It's either Hitler or a fascist or a Nazi or a racist. It's all that kind of stuff. And, of course, what the consensus actually means, how it translates in the end. They're saying, when they say we don't want a return of the Nazis and we don't want a return of authoritarianism, what they actually mean is we don't want nationalism. That's the bottom line. Ever since the Second World War, there's been a war against nationalism. And you can see why the consensus would have happened. Because when the Cold War happens after 1945, okay, you now have liberals in America, communists in Russia. Now, they don't agree on everything, okay? I mean, there's a lot of things they don't like about each other. But there's one thing they can agree on. They don't like nationalists. They don't like the right wing. They both agree on that. And so that becomes the consensus. It becomes the one thing they can agree on. And they build an entire global system after 1945 on the consensus, we're going to knock out all nationalists. We're going to make nationalism impossible. And they do. It's like literally a program after that. You see them knock out nationalism, one country after another. They just knock them out. Not allowed. Not allowed. It's verboten. Can't have that stuff. And of course, that is why there's this, the left is in deep angst at the moment with Trump, because they literally see Trump as Hitler coming back. It's like, oh my God, it's really finally happening. Whoa, what's going to happen now? Well, I remember being in a meeting at UQ when Trump got elected that day. It was the funniest meeting I've ever been at. I mean, I had to work at not bursting out laughing because these people were like literally crying. They couldn't believe it. It's like, my God, Hitler's coming back. And I'm sitting there going, you guys are crazy. You actually are not normal.
Yeah.
I mean, they were really distraught because they were anywheres. And of course, I'm sitting there, and I couldn't keep the smile off my face. And they suddenly looked at me and they went, you're not with us. You're not one of us. You think Trump's okay. We can see it. And I walked into this meeting, and there were these people that were just, they were like someone, they were stunned. They were just sitting there in absolute silence. The meeting never actually happened. They could not actually do the meeting. They just sat there looking at each other. And something had like tears in their eyes. They were like, and then they sort of like, did you hear? It's inconceivable. The Americans voted for Trump. What? And then some of them, males I might add, started crying. I mean, they were just beside themselves. It was the end of the world. And it was like, and then it's Hitler's coming back. It's like, and I'm going, what are you talking about? I mean, and I'm trying not to show that I think they're crazy people. And eventually, they're all looking terribly sad. And I must have got this smile on my face. Okay, and they could see I'm not one of them. And you could see them look at me like there was this dawning realization, you're not one of us. What you think? You actually think this other dude's okay? It was the funniest meeting of my life. I mean, I've never forgotten it. It was just that moment it's also when I realized, hell, I'm not like you dudes. I don't want to be here anymore. You guys are mad. Okay, it was just that, So yeah, it was amusing at the time. Not for them.
Look, mate, this culture war stuff that's going on at the moment gets painted as a war for the West. But when we talk about what happened at World War II and what's happened since, and some of your arguments today, could you argue that the West basically came to an end in World War II and we've just seen it being swept away ever since? I mean, is there anything left that we can fight for or try and preserve, or have we seen too much of it being swept away to the point now where it's like, where do we go from here?
And look, when I look at, I'm alarmed by the situation. Okay, so much has happened, and it's pretty bad. I mean, there are many, many policy decisions that have been made since 1945, which are all part of this Pax Americana thing, which have been shocking. Okay, if you had to ask me which I think is the most shocking of all the policies that might ever have happened, when I say this, I'm going to make half the world hate me immediately, I'm sure. It was the pill. I think the pill was a catastrophe for the West in a way that people simply don't understand. You see, what the Pax Americana brought, what it has created, is what we can call hyper-liberalism. It's like liberalism went mad. Liberalism. So many people on the right say that the problem is Marxism. And yes, Marxism is a problem, no question. I explained how Frantz Fanon and Said and these Marxists, huge influence, very bad. But the real problem is the liberal left. You know, the Teals, those kind of dudes. They are much more dangerous because it was the liberal left who opened the door. They control all these liberal institutions. They let the Marxists in. They let this Marxist thing go crazy. Now, one of the worst things that happens in the 1960s, and so much of what has happened since can be traced back to them. When the pull comes on stream, and now these hyper-liberals are pushing the idea of extreme individualism, because that's what hyper-liberalism is. It's like it's hyper-individualism. Every individual can do exactly as they want. There can be no we. And of course, that comes from the idea that nationalists and Nazis are all about nationalist we. So we must destroy we and replace it with the individual. Only the individual matters. And we must hype it up. Now, in the 1960s, when the pull comes along, they go, all women have a right to decide for themselves. You can decide if you want to be pregnant or not want to be pregnant. If you have a baby, you can decide if you want to have an abortion because you have a right as an individual to do whatever you want. Now, that was the beginning. It has spread from there. That was the original one. But if you look at it, just look where that idea has gone since. Now, I can decide I don't want to be a man. I want to be a girl, or I want to be a frog, or whatever I want to be now. You can just decide it because you're an individual. You can decide anything for yourself. The idea is crazy. I mean, hyperliberalism has gone mad. And it's been deeply infected. Worse still, hyperliberalism in the American universities got infected by this lefty, this Marxist stuff, this neo-Marxist stuff. So now it's a kind of peculiar hybrid of Marxism and liberalism, which you should never have been able to do, but some of these dudes managed to do this. And they produced this very, very peculiar ideology. But of course, the disaster was when women decided we can decide if we have babies or not, and then they all decided, no, we'd rather go and make money and take over the world and have affirmative action or DEI, kick all the men out and put women in. When they decided they wanted to do that instead, well, that was the end. Because we don't reproduce ourselves. I mean, that is the single biggest catastrophe in the West. We are not making enough babies to reproduce ourselves. Now, if you've now got a bunch of bureaucratic technicists running governments, which is what we've ended up with, okay, and they don't give a shit. And remember, they're not nationalists anymore because they've all been taught that to have loyalty to your nation is it's disgusting. It's racist. How could you possibly do such a thing? So they all truly believe that. Now, I'm not a racist. I'm never going to show you I'm a racist. So I'm going to take decisions to prove I'm not a racist. All right, so now we're going to have a migration policy. Our women are not making enough babies, but we need to grow the economy. If we need to grow the economy, we would bring a whole bunch of mass migrants in here. But we can't be racist. So we'll just bring the whole of India here. We'll bring the whole of China here, or whatever, because what the hell? We're all the same. We're all citizens of the world. We don't have to protect our culture. We can just bring anybody else's culture here. And it doesn't matter. That's where we've got to. That's where this has all led to. And it's catastrophic.
Are we making the mistake? You talk about hyperliberalism being, the individual, but we attack socialism and Marxism and communism, which we view as the we, the collective. Is there a difference? Are we attacking the wrong?
Well, okay. Look, I mean, I'm not I'm not into the communist thing. I wouldn't choose that. So put it this way: it's like you asked me. I mean, America's done all these terrible things, right? I think that when the Americans destroyed the British Empire, it's truly catastrophic. It's for the West. It is just a disaster because the Americans have not done a particularly good job since then. Okay, so I'm not wildly excited about the Pax Americana, but if you had to say to me, well, would you rather be ruled by the Chinese or would you rather be ruled by the Americans? Hey, I'm still going to go for the Americans. I don't really want Chinese communists to run the world. So I'm not going for the communist model. But of course, they're two different kinds of collectives. You get the left-wing version of collectivism is socialism and communism. The right, there's a right-wing version of it as well, which is it's nationalism. Nationalism is a we.
But you're getting my thoughts going now.
Yeah.
Go back to the War of Independence, where it was we are the British Empire, and and we're all the part of the Commonwealth or the Empire, and we're all together. And the Americans go, no, we're on our own. We're going to fight for our freedom, sovereignty, individualism. Is that part of it too? I mean,
well, it turned out that wasn't catastrophic for the West at the time, because what happened is that the British for the British it wasn't a particularly great moment. Okay, so the British lose one empire, but they build another empire. All right, and also at that stage, the Americans haven't moved in the direction they've moved in now. I mean, the Americans actually just carry on being British. They're just doing it somewhere else, and I mean for at least another century, the Americans are just British. Okay, they're just Republican British, but they haven't changed their culture. The cultural changes have only come in this 20th century, and I think they've come in since 1945. 1945 is the watershed. It does something terrible.
Well, could that go back to the point of the war itself? I mean, who are you sending off to war? You're sending off your more nationalistic people, the people that are driven to defend their country, and the people that are staying home, and the people going, I'm not going to fight my country.
That's probably true. That probably has something to do with it as well. That might well have had an effect. I mean that's quite possible that would have played into it as well. I just think that in the Second World War you had this confluence of factors, which the Americans did get their empire up. They knocked out the British Empire, but in the process it transformed Americans. Okay, so not immediately, but in the 1950s you see the change already. I mean, the new story that the Americans start to tell themselves about themselves happens in the 1950s. There's a number of things that happen. So one of the things that I tracked out was this, all right? And it's Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt's wife, again, is part of the story because I think she has a big role to play in this. Sometimes individuals can play a massive role, and I think she did. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt had a thing about racism. She hated racists, okay? And she persuaded her husband, amongst other things, to create the United Nations system, which they did. The United Nations was the system by which America was supposed to run its empire. They would write the rules of it. They would therefore control the empire. And one of the organizations they created was UNESCO. After Roosevelt dies, Eleanor Roosevelt carries on behaving as if she's the wife of the president, even though he's dead. And she has enormous influence in the State Department because Roosevelt has filled the State Department with left-wing people. And they love her. And so she just carries on working in the State Department, basically, with all these people. They're all her buddies. And amongst the things that she gets started is that UNESCO starts an anti-racism program. Very big deal. Now, they've got the entire resources of UNESCO thrown at this. And what happens is that if you go back 1920s, there was a guy, an obscure little anthropologist called Boas, who was pushing the idea that race does not exist. Race is, if you say there's a black person, there's a white person, that's crazy. There's no such thing, he says. race doesn't exist. It's just a crazy construct invented by racists. Okay. And he tries to sell this idea for decades, and everybody goes, he's mad. What happens is one of his students gets employed by UNESCO, 1950s, a guy called Montague. Montague works for UNESCO, and he works, of course, with Roosevelt's wife, and they put together this unbelievable anti-racism program. And it works. It just works. They put the idea out that race does not exist. Race is a figment of racist imagination. Racists just invent this thing. It's not there. And it's a little bit like what I suppose Goebbels says, if you keep saying something often enough, people will believe you. So if you keep saying race doesn't exist, race doesn't exist, race doesn't exist, eventually it doesn't exist. And we hear them. We hear journalists say that all the time now. Like every day, every couple of days, I hear some journalists say this stupid thing. Now, that became the new guiding ideology in the way, particularly in America. UNESCO pushed it everywhere in the world, but it took off in America big time. And that was one of the things that contributed to the civil rights thing in the 1950s. They picked up on this and said, yeah, you see, race doesn't exist. Racists thought this up. And we've got great examples of what racists do. These damn Nazis, look at what they do. We don't want to be like that. At the same time that happens, okay, another neo-Marxist called Adorno writes a book called Authoritarian Personality. And what does that say? The only people who are Nazis and fascists are authoritarians, like Hitler. We must never allow that to happen again. And that feeds into the consensus, that idea that the post-Second World War consensus, they pick up on this idea of UNESCO, they pick up on this idea of Adorno, they feed it into this American thing, and it turns into the civil rights thing. And then, of course, Americans have a guilt thing about slavery, and voila, next thing we know is the whole world must have a guilt about American slavery. And that blends in with the decolonization thing. So, the American university is at the heart of all of this. And they construct these ideas, and they pump them out, and of course, everybody in the whole Anglo world catches them.
Mate, this has been a very fascinating interview. I mean, I could talk to you all day about this, but we've already talked for 2.5 hours with all the technical difficulties and everything that has been going on. So, mate, I really appreciate your time, and hopefully I can get you back on again in the future, because I think this is a new way of thinking about things. I mean, the stuff that you were telling me about the Americans coming in and putting pressure on the British to dismantle their empire, I've never heard anything about that before. And I've been looking at history for a very long time. That's never come up, and you're saying that you've found the evidence for that.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that book that I wrote, the Pax Americana one, it actually did so well they eventually put it out as a paperback. So that's where I spell it out. I spell out the whole story in there.
Yeah, and you can. It seems to be still available on Amazon. So if you want to check out the book, you can still get it there. The Roots of the Pax Americana. I'll put the link in the show notes so people can check that out if they want to. And hopefully I can get you back on in the future with maybe some more stable connections, and we can have this conversation in another direction, because I think we need to start to reevaluate the history and what we've been told, because we just take World War II as being this great, or wasn't a great thing, but the Americans came in and saved the day. Yeah, but no, this has been a very interesting conversation. So thank you very much for coming on, Professor Louw. I've really appreciated it.
That's been good. Yep. Okay.
And for everyone else out there, please head to commandingthenarrative.com, sign up to the newsletter, stay up to date with everything that we're doing, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Yeah.